Well, hello and welcome to the Reconstructionist podcast, where we are helping you reconstruct while you deconstruct so you don't self-destruct. So, this week we have a returning guest, Elita Friesen. Elita, of course, was on our podcast before to talk about women in the church, and she talked about her and Chris Price's book, The Whole Church, which is really awesome. I highly recommend it as a resource just for you to check out. It's super short, but it kind of goes through the Bible and women leadership and all those different things. But this week, she's not talking about that. Instead, she's talking about a talk that she gave at a conference that we both were at, called the Canadian Church Leaders Network Conference, that was in Vancouver, with practicing the way, so like what John Mark Comer is doing now and the CCLN network kind of combined together. And she gave this really incredible talk, actually, on the current state of the church and pastors and just Christians in general. And so pretty much, you probably don't know this, but for like I've taken a short break from this podcast since the last time we would have talked. And so I hit pause just because I was sorting through a bunch of stuff in my life, and I was like, I don't have time for this right now. And so you're actually one of the first people of relaunching it again, kind of from that little bit of a pause. So yeah.
Well, awesome. Double thank you for having me.
Well, yeah, hopefully it's a good experience. We'll see. You can thank me later. If you were like, that was terrible, then it'll be like, okay. But for those who don't know who you are, can you just give, because you've been on here before, and we talked about you and Chris's book, actually, The Whole Church, which is an awesome book. And if people haven't purchased it yet, I highly encourage you to, because it's super short, which means that for most people, they're like, great, I don't want to read like a 400-page book on women in ministry and what that means. And it's super helpful. But for those who don't know who you are, can you just give like a little intro to who you are, what you do, and what you've been up to lately?
Sure. So I'm Elita, and I live in Langley, which is it's on the west coast of BC. It's like an hour outside of Vancouver, for those who are not super familiar with the area. And I live here with my husband, Ryan. We actually just celebrated our 20th wedding anniversary, which feels crazy, but also awesome.
Congrats.
Yeah, thank you. And then we have 4 kids. We have a 17-year-old, 14-year-old, 12-year-old, and then a daughter who just turned 8. So it's just kind of, we're like all the emotions, you know what I mean? Like 8, second grader, all the way to an 11th grader. So all the things, we've got it all in the house. And then that's kind of my personal life. And then on the work front, I work at the Way Church in Vancouver, and I've been there. We actually planted during COVID, September 2020. So great strategic move.
Great time to launch.
Yeah, you know what? Obviously, it was kind of the plan already, and then it happened. COVID happened, and then it is what it is. And you know what? We're doing just fine. God's been really faithful. But I'm on the pastoral team and the teaching team there, and that is kind of my life: preaching, teaching, being a mom, writing curriculum, and I'm also a student at Regent, just to kind of like, in case I wasn't busy enough, I should just, do this. I'm hoping I'll finish about this time next year. So we'll see.
Wow. What are you taking?
I'm working on my Master's of Arts in Christian Studies.
Oh, wow.
I'm not doing the MA.
You don't have your MA yet? That surprises me. Wow. Well, there you go. Well, I would have just assumed you already did. So congrats. They should just hand it to you, because they'll be like, she's smart enough. Just give it to her. That's awesome. Yeah, your guys' church is really cool, because I was able to watch it from the beginning of COVID and be like, oh, we'll see. And it was interesting because actually when you launched, you had the unique opportunity of not having, like, because a lot of churches went through the weird phase of how do we do what we did and now do it online, and you guys were just like, oh, I guess we'll just do it online. And so you guys were able to like do online in a cool way, and then seeing the transition out, it's been super cool. Because I think the last time we talked, I think either it was with you or it was with Jason, I can't remember which one it was, but it was like you just started really meeting in person, and that was a huge adjustment to be like, this is so weird because we've never done this before. It's super weird.
Yeah. And you know what? There's so many phases during, coming out of like the restrictions. And so there was the phase where you could meet, but you had to wear masks. And then you're like, have I met you on Zoom before? I don't remember who you are. And then anyways, but glad to be where we are now. So
Yeah. No, that's awesome. Yeah, and that's great. And also, you recently were a part of like a conference ran by the Canadian Church Leaders Network, and also kind of
mhm,
partnering with Practicing the Way with like John Mark Comer and what he's doing
yeah,
now post Bridgetown Church. And so that was
yeah.
awesome. That was a cool experience for me because I initially was like, oh, I really like John Mark Comer. I really like Tyler Staten. I didn't know who Ken was at the time. And I'm like, oh, that guy's so awesome. And I was like, oh, and Alita's going to be there. Okay, I'll sign up. And a bunch of people from my church actually ended up going who were on staff. And so it
Oh,
was a ton of fun. It was great for me. But it was funny because when you preached, my wife, Emily, was like, she's the best. That was the best one. She was super pumped.
oh
And
man.
I think a lot of people felt that way, that like your message was super great. And so in thinking about relaunching the podcast, because when I initially started this thing too, I just picked a bunch of people who said things that I thought were super helpful in my own life. And I was like, if it was helpful to me, they'll probably be helpful to other people. And so I kind of did the same thing for this, where I was like, man, your message was super impactful and it was really honestly really good. So I was like, I just wanted to, so in a selfish way, I just get to kind of sit down with you and pick your brain for a bit
Yes.
on that message.
Well,
But for you, you obviously had a different experience at that conference than me, as someone who's speaking at me who's just like chilling. But I was wondering for you, if anything stood out to you from that conference that was like a big takeaway that you felt like sharing, or even for people who don't know what
mhm.
CCLN is, if you could tell them a bit about that too, because some people in America, for example, are like, what is that? So,
Well, I'll start with that. CCLN is a Canadian Christian Leadership Network, and it's really interesting because at the same time that we planted the way, one of the big visions that we had for our church was that we would have a branch of our church that would be a place where people could come from all over Canada to get training, and also a
mm,
place where pastors could find support from other pastors, very ecumenically minded. Um, and so that kind of birthed CCLN in a way. So
mm,
it's very tied up with the way. Um, However, it is very much its own entity. It has its own staff. It's got its own, people who work there. And but the way feels very deeply connected to
yeah,
CCLN in a lot of ways. We consider it kind of like, I don't know if calling it a ministry of the way is a fair word, but it was birthed at the same time out of the same vision of we want to be a local church in Vancouver, but we also have this national heart for
mm,
pastors across Canada, and that's what CCLN is. So it was real. To answer your question about what the takeaway for me was, two things, if I can say two. The first one is
yep,
that I always, my whole life, my dad's a pastor, and I mentioned that at the conference. So I have always found it incredibly special to be in a room with other pastors. Um, for a lot of reasons. I think just growing up and having seen the behind the scenes of a pastor's life. My dad
mm,
pastored a local small church congregation, and just to see the pull, the highs and the lows, and all of it, and I just see how important these kinds of things are for pastors. So
yeah,
it just, for one thing, felt super special. I felt so not just honored to be in the room, but humbled to be in the room. I think it's so
mm,
beautiful when you get different. I mean, I can't remember how many different churches and denominations were
yeah,
represented,
a
but there were
ton.
a lot, a ton. And so even that felt so special. And I think I
Mm,
talked to a lot of people who really felt since that there's a real sense of unity, despite our obvious differences. And so that felt great. And then another thing, oh man, I took so many notes. You probably you probably did too. But I think one of the things that really stuck out to me was probably when John Mark was talking. Of course, him and
mm,
Tyler, for those who weren't there, it was a spiritual formation event. So it was all about this idea of, how do we be a people who are in our churches that are being formed spiritually, with the idea being that it doesn't happen on accident. Like none of us are going to get to a fruitful relationship with Jesus just kind of stumbling our way into it. There's got to be like
yeah,
path, a path. And so I appreciated John Mark's. He talked about the crisis of discipleship. I don't know if you
mm,
remember that. And
mhm,
he used this great line, and it was I don't know, I can't remember if it was a revelation that he had or he heard somewhere, because he quotes so many people. He's so
yeah,
smart. He reads so much. But the quote that he said was something along the lines of, teaching people what the Bible says isn't the same thing as teaching them how to obey what the Bible
Mm,
says.
mm,
And so the question then was, and I think that for me, as somebody who's a preacher, teacher on staff at our church, and even as a mom, I was thinking about this. Okay, then the how question, how do we teach them? And I think the proposal then that kind of was a springboard into the rest of the conference going, okay, so how do we answer that question? How do we make disciples, not just teach
mm-hmm.
people, but actually disciple them? And the answer then is through spiritual formation. And so I left thinking two things. I thought about our church. How are we teaching our people to obey? Are we doing discipleship well? And then, so I was thinking about the kind of like the macro level of our church, but then also the micro level of myself,
Yeah.
thinking, okay, and is my own schedule, like my rule of life, aligned with my values? And what is my
Mm.
rule of life? I mean, I know that we all have one. I have one that's written down. I have a written down rule of life. But then I was also thinking, I mean, it's just for myself. It was just kind of, it's not like pasted
Yeah.
anywhere. Nobody sees it when they
It's
walk
a
in my
big
house.
plaque when they walk in. This is what she does.
Yeah.
Look at how awesome I am.
Yes. Yeah. Crochet it into something. No, I have it written down somewhere, and it changes every year.
Mm,
Maybe sometimes more than once a year, depending on things that are happening in my own life. But so I have a rule of life. The question that I was asking myself when I left the conference is, am I actually living out my rule of life? You can
mm,
write it down all you want, but what is
yeah.
because we all have really a rule of life, whether we're living it or not. So there's my written down one, there's my actual practices. And I was just kind of comparing and contrasting those. So I took away so many things.
Yeah.
It was a really great conference.
Yeah, it really was. And that's what I felt like a lot of people. That's how I felt. It was because I messaged Jason after and I was like, I just wanted to say that that conference was super refreshing for me to be able to
Oh,
meet with like a bunch of churches and to be talking. It just felt like all the conversations I was having with pastors and staff behind closed doors that we were actually like having it all together. Be like, wow, like this is literally addressing things that I've been thinking and feeling, and a lot of people were. And I think too, that's part of the post COVID thing. Because I think in
mhm,
COVID, we saw what our discipleship was really like. Because you can
mhm,
have like the facade of we've got a lot of people here and it feels like we're really making an impact. And then when you kind of churches had to pull back because they couldn't physically meet and you were able to see what kind of disciples you were making on their own, you were like, oh no, this is not what we thought we were making. This isn't
yeah,
good. And so to be able to wrestle through those things, I found super helpful, and even just putting language to some of the stuff we were feeling. Yeah, John Mark
yeah,
Comer saying that stood out to me as well. When it's like we can teach people like a bunch of facts about the Bible, but unless it's actually transforming who you are,
mhm.
it's useless. Which isn't like a mind blowing statement. Like
No,
you're like, yeah, Jesus said that all the time. That was his main gripe with the Pharisees, was that they knew a lot of stuff, but it didn't change anything. But I don't know, we forget it often. You though
mhm,
talk specifically at the end, and you hit something that I was really glad you hit, because as a pastor and as someone who has been around other pastors, it's really true that a lot of especially pastoral staff are feeling, because there's all the COVID stuff, but even with that, we're like depending what province you're in or where you live, we're like 2-3 years out from kind of the strict lockdown thing, but
mhm,
the exhaustion from it and the burnout, because you talked about this too, is still like lingering, and it feels like
right.
it's actually getting worse where we thought it would get better, and people are feeling worse. It's like, what is going on? And so I just
Right.
wanted to ask you about that. What do you think? Why do you think people and pastors, even though it's 2023 and 2020 was actually like on paper a while ago,
Mhm.
why do you think people are still struggling with that feeling of exhaustion and burnout?
Uh, I'm not an expert necessarily on this. I'll give my opinion on why
Mm,
I think, and it's different. It's so interesting because I had a lot of those conversations, as you were mentioning, and some people are doing awesome in church right now. Like
mhm.
it's the best. And then there doesn't seem to be a lot of middle ground. Then it's like
Yeah,
amazing or terrible.
yeah.
And we're just kind of struggling. And so I realized that, and I knew that going into the conference, that this is not a necessarily everybody is struggling with
Hmm.
burnout. But the statistics show that there's an overwhelming percentage. Like there's enough. It's almost 50%. It's like
Yeah.
42%. So of people in pastoral ministry who are seriously, and that's not an old stat. That's in the last 12 months. And
Hmm.
so, and that's a Barna did that. I mean, it's reputable information. And so it's showing that, okay, there's enough people who feel this. And I think there's a lot of reasons. I think racial tension has been a big thing,
Yeah.
political unrest, and even just the overplay of those two, which are a very obvious thing. And then the interesting thing about COVID is that it's caused so much relational tension. I mean, I think of all so many relationships, whether it's family relationships, friendships,
Hmm.
workplace, and then within the church. So many different ways it's kind of bled into different areas. And then specific to the church, there's things that have caused exhaustion, the deconstruction movement, which is not all bad. That is,
Yeah.
it's not a bad thing for people to know why they believe what they believe. I
Hmm.
think the church, and I'm just saying that in a broad sweeping statement. I know, but I think the church in general has struggled to catch up in knowing how to respond. It was kind of
Yeah.
this. So there's that, and then of course the rise of internet, social media. Facebook was created in 2004, which is kind of wild to me. I was in college. I remember when Facebook was first created, which I know not everybody does Facebook anymore. And everybody's like, I only do it for Marketplace. I only do it for Marketplace.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
okay,
They're trying to
whatever.
justify.
Yeah,
I'm not
yeah.
old.
No, exactly. That's exactly what it is. But I remember when it came out, and it was back, and you're not old enough for this probably,
No, I was
but
in
it was
grade 4, so no.
okay, yeah. So you are not old enough. So when it was first created, it was only for college students, and you had to have like
Hmm.
a legit college email. And so my college wasn't big enough to qualify me, so I couldn't be on Facebook. And my friends were like, "Oh, what kind of school do you go to?" And I felt very judged. Anyways, all that to say, that was 2004. So if anybody who is 18 or younger, they have not known a world where
Mm,
social media hasn't been this huge thing. And that's not to say it's just Facebook. Obviously, there's been so many different things, but just the way
yeah.
that has shaped and is shaping, particularly teenagers and young people. I have kids, and even if they don't have phones, which some of mine don't, and even if they themselves do not have social media, I mean, we're getting emails all the time from the school warning us and telling us the
Mm,
trends that are happening at school, which apps to stay away from because they're so it is actually shaping, at least in the West. This is not a broad global statement, but in the West, it's shaping minds, and so and what people want and believe. So anyways, there's that's I think causing some form of exhaustion, particularly probably among youth pastors, and how to keep up and how to keep the attention of kids. And
mhm,
then there's also just this reality of we live in a post-Christian world. Christendom is not the assumed way of life anymore. It's not the norm. And so there's just so many different things that even before COVID were already pastors were already having to navigate through, and not just pastors, but staff at church and boards and elder teams,
yeah,
like and just as a believer, you're navigating through all of these things. And so I think that when COVID came along, it pushed the people. Pushed is maybe a strong word, but the people who were already like what you were talking about earlier, maybe on the margins of the church, were kind of there.
mhm,
COVID was kind of like the thing that was like, okay, you know what? I don't want to do this anymore.
yeah,
And in fact, I don't have to do this anymore because nobody's going to church anymore. So
yeah,
coming back from that has been tiring because you're trying to figure out, are you reclaiming people? Are you going after them? Um, how do we keep shifting? Do we keep the online church? There's so many, do we do this? How do we do this? Questions. And not to mention that pastors are, and I see this especially in older congregations, they don't have an online presence. They have no idea
mhm,
how to go about even doing that. And they just
yeah,
miss the simpler days of people just showed up at 10.
Yeah.
And, sometimes I miss that too, if I'm
Hmm.
honest, because I wouldn't know how to do it. I'm thankful for a team of people a generation younger than me who know how to. So it's tiring. There's a lot of things that are
Yeah.
tiring.
Well, and you name a lot of things there that give me a lot of different thoughts. Because even with that too, I think it's almost like, because I think you said in your talk, and correct me if I'm wrong, that
Mhm,
around the beginning of COVID, the like pastors who were feeling burnt out and exhausted and like maybe I'm going to throw in the towel was like 30%. And
mhm.
now today it's actually risen to like
Right.
40% ish, which
That's
is
right.
interesting. And I almost feel like it's not just one thing. I think it's like the death by a thousand cuts
It is.
for everybody, where it's like the exhaustion of being locked down and having the back and forth of like, what
Mhm,
am I supposed to do? What can't I do? Why can't I just go back to normal? Oh, but things suck.
mm,
And then you also had both in America and in Canada tensions with their pasts and how they've treated people who were not white coming into different countries or having slavery, and that created a bunch of more polarization on top of the already polarizing COVID that
yeah,
you as a pastor are trying to navigate. As I've got people in the congregation on both sides who don't agree, and I'm trying to bring them to like a
yeah.
more Jesus centered view of these things, and then it just kept going to where there's a bunch of different things. I think because in the US they had kind of like January 6th. I think it was January 6th where it was the storming of the Capitol, and then Canada had something similar in its kind of feeling and division, which was like the Freedom Convoy. And it felt like this big like we're never going to end the polarizing, so that was exhausting our relationships.
Yeah.
And then you've got things like inflation and cost of living that like pastors don't make a lot of money, and
Mhm,
so constantly being like, I love the job I do, but I don't know if I can feed my family is like
mhm.
a hard, heavy thing to carry
Yeah.
for some people all the time. And then your church is like shrunk and you've like didn't know how to do online. And you're like, did we do it the best? And then you kind of came out of it like, oh, okay, well, we can go back to normal. And then you realize, no, we can't. And so
Mhm.
it's just this like heavy weight of like, of all these things that
Yeah.
if it was just one of them, we'd probably be okay. But because it's so
So
many,
many.
it feels like it's just
And
exhausting.
and they all feel connected is the
Yeah,
thing. You pull the
they're
string on
not separate.
one. Yeah, you pull the string on one and it pulls the other somehow. And that's yeah, it's a lot.
Yeah. Well, and then too, it was interesting because you talk about my around my generation. I'm like a really late Gen Z, where I could
Mhm.
either be a really young millennial or a really old Gen Z. I'm in that like weird age bracket of like
Okay.
I don't really fit in either. But it's interesting because we were in a meeting about vision and the future of our church, and to hear like different perspectives, and even to see how I've changed in my view of this of what online is.
Mhm.
And for a long time, even I was in this camp of being like, online isn't real. Like you need real people in your life who are pouring into you, which I still think is true. But then also recognizing that I said at one point in that meeting, I was like, but for Gen Z and the younger generation, online is real. Like it doesn't matter if to us we're like, this isn't real discipleship. You aren't, no one knows who you are and is discipling you. To them, it's real. It's such
Mhm.
like a weird shift. And so churches are like, I don't know how to do that well. We're not equipped to, we don't have the people to, we barely have enough people to run a Sunday, let alone
Yeah.
also figure out what online looks like. And so it's just exhausting.
Yeah.
There's a lot of things. But with that, there's also been, and it's actually interesting to look at the statistics and what's happened, because there was for some people a large initial drop off at the beginning
Mhm.
of COVID for
Yeah.
churches of like attendance and finances. And I remember when everybody was kind of laying off staff in like reaction, and in Canada it was different too because you could lay them off and be like, I know they're still going to get paid because we had like CERB and stuff. So it was kind of
Right.
different in Canada than maybe somewhere else. But there was that initial reaction, which is interesting for you guys because you guys have just been launching from COVID. And I don't know, I can't be in your shoes, so I don't know for sure. But it feels like, from my perspective, I would think things have been exciting and felt like they're moving up. Or for
Mhm.
others, it just feels like it's a continual downward spiral of like we went online and then it kept going. And then we were back in person, then we weren't in person, then we were back in person. And then we were finally back in person fully. We're like, okay, things
Mhm.
will get more normal. Like we know our attendance will be lower. But it's been interesting to watch some churches that even 3 years out from 2020, they're now seeing congregations still go on the decline. And even now, for our church specifically, we didn't have a deficit at all. during all of COVID, but this year was actually the first time they've had a deficit budget. It's interesting because it's 3 years out, and so you're like, "What's
Yeah.
going on?"
Mhm.
And so all these kind of churches are experiencing 2 different things, because I have heard pastors say, "We've actually had a ton of growth." Because I remember I was actually mad once where I was like, "You suck." Where I remember Mark Clark saying like, "We're bigger than ever," when he was at Village before he left to go to, California. Yeah, that guy, California, come on. But when he was there, he's like, "Things are booming," and I was sitting there being like, "This is terrible. I'm so mad at you because I wish things were booming." And so I just wanted to pick your brain on that as to why you think possibly, because obviously, like, I don't know, neither of us fully know, but we have some kind of inklings as to why you think even 3 years out, it feels like churches are still feeling that kind of decline. And there are churches who are feeling like things are up and to the right and looking really good, but there's a lot of churches who are like, it feels like we just keep struggling and it's not getting better. And so I just wondered what your thoughts were on that, as to why
Yeah.
maybe that is, or
Well, for
what.
one thing, I think what it did is, especially in the smaller churches, it caused division in the smaller churches. And so
Mm,
then smaller churches start closing and larger churches start absorbing. So
yeah.
that's one thing. And then again, going back to what was already in place before the pandemic, where you had maybe smaller congregations, older congregations, where they didn't know how to, and I'm going to use the word, the famous COVID word, they didn't know how to pivot,
Yeah.
or they couldn't. They didn't have the tools or the skill set, and then you can't meet in person with anybody to even
Mm,
figure out how to. So it just kind of caused this. I guess we're closing, and so then those people are finding new church bodies. Um, I think the most unfortunate, in my opinion, the most unfortunate thing that has happened is the churches who just couldn't agree to disagree,
mm,
and then they either split, or it just caused irreparable damage in
yeah.
some congregations, and that grieves me, and I'm so sad about that. But then on the other side, there's the reality, and you already named it, that there's a lot of people, and not just Gen Zs, but like people who are older than me, who realized, oh, I can stay home and do church, and this is actually way more convenient, and I can still make my kid's soccer game and not have to
Yeah.
try to fit church in. Um, and so, yeah, like you, I have feelings about that. Um, and that's not to, you know what? The online thing served a purpose, still serves a purpose really well.
Hmm.
I love that if I'm sick or if it's snowing outside, as it is right now, that you can, you don't have to go out and battle the roads, and you can stay home and you can still feel like you're connected.
Hmm.
I do think the danger of going solely online is that it can remove your need for community.
Yeah.
um, Obviously, there were ways, and we figured it out during COVID, of doing the online discipleship thing. I am
Hmm.
just convinced, though, that it is life on life and life experience together. Whenever you're not in a place, part of a place, um, it's really hard to grab the vision of
Yeah.
what they're trying to do, and then that impacts your giving, that impacts your willingness to be involved, your willingness to. I mean, like, how can you serve? I mean, these are questions that I have. So that's not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. That's not to say
Hmm.
we never do online church. I don't think that at all. I'm so grateful that we do it. We did it as a family yesterday. I mean, there are great things about it. I just think, generally speaking, that has played a huge impact on church numbers. People who are now doing it online or hopping around. I talk to a lot of people who hop around now, on online church. They
Yeah.
will go here or there, or they'll go to a church somewhere totally, totally different. And I read a stat. Um, and I'm trying to remember where it's from. It was a reputable. It might have been in the Globe and Mail, actually.
Mm,
But they said that the pandemic ended. This was a U.S. stat, but I think it still plays into Canada. That the pandemic ended church going for 20 million people.
mm.
In other words, 20 million people did not come back,
That's
even
crazy.
after restrictions were lifted. So obviously, that number would be lower here. But I think what
Mhm.
you're saying is we have felt it in some ways. People are either online or not back at all. They just kind of realized. They were, I would quantify that by, or qualify that statement by saying that um, those were very likely probably people who were already kind of on the margins of faith, and maybe weren't involved in a small group, or weren't serving, or weren't, just kind of on the margins, just kind of came, weren't really doing much. So yeah, that's my guesstimate on
Yeah.
why this is still happening. And I think if you got 10 pastors in a room and asked them about their particular circumstances, it'd probably be slightly different for each
Hmm.
one, but some of that's gonna come into play.
No, totally. And yeah, it's interesting thinking about that and looking back, because even from my perspective, and it could be wrong, but in the losses that churches have faced, it's interesting to watch giving and how for a lot of churches, for the most part, giving has not been as impacted as attendance has been,
Hmm.
which to me speaks of something as to the people who stayed were the people who were pretty invested,
Yeah. Hmm.
and a lot of the people who left, which is still sad, but were people who were less invested into,
Yeah.
whether it was just the church and they just saw the pandemic as their like get out free card to go somewhere else, which some
Hmm.
people did, where they were like, I don't have to have the awkward conversation of why aren't you going to our church anymore? I can just leave.
Yeah.
And some
Yeah.
people did that, which is totally fine. And other people just slowly, I saw this happen a lot. Their faith just kind of eroded over through isolation and not being able to wrestle through when there's big crazy things happening in the country or whatever, that they can't wrestle through that with community, and then seeing how churches have responded and sometimes not being fully satisfied and being able to have that conversation that really
Mhm.
affected their faith and where they were at. And so there's a lot of different reasons for sure. And it's been interesting, and I wonder what it'll look like in the future, because if you told me at the beginning that we'd still be feeling the effects of it 3 years later, I'd be like, well, even when I remember I was in a meeting, and so the lockdown happened in March,
Mhm.
and I remember it was like May, and I remember that the lead pastor and the executive pastor of the church I was working at the time were talking about how we'll probably still be locked down until September. I remember just even that, I was like, there's no way. You got to,
Yeah.
what? We're going to be locked down till September? And then
I
thinking
know.
about it now, like if I knew that the effects of this would last kind of 3 years out, my mind would have exploded. I don't think I would have been able to handle it
I
emotionally.
think so. I mean, there's so, aren't we all so grateful that we had no idea? Because we would have
Yeah.
all been like, "Are you kidding me? Are
Yeah.
you actually?" I mean, thank God we didn't know.
No.
Literally, thank you, Lord.
Yeah.
We
It's
didn't know.
sometimes it's best we don't know the full
It is.
grasp of
It is.
what's going to happen. Um,
Mhm.
with that being said, because I don't want to just stay in the negative, and you
Mhm.
didn't stay in the negative either. You moved really quickly to the positive, because there is a lot of positivity, and I actually feel, even being at that conference, that there was a lot of excitement about what God is doing and the direction that
Mhm.
things can go, and we're maybe in a situation that has things that require mourning, but also has a lot of hope and is an incredible opportunity for the future. And you really talked about this, and actually, they gave out a bookmark at
Oh,
the
yeah.
end. So, kind of, your talk turned into like the main thing that everybody got to keep at the end. And I don't know if that was a coincidence or what, but I thought I was like, look, that was the whole sermon.
Yeah.
Because you talked about remaining in the vine, and you talked about, because you preached on Jesus talking about that and what that means.
Mhm.
And right now I live in the Okanagan Valley, and so it was
Okay.
funny to hear your story about you looking for grapes and being
Yeah.
like, "Oh, sure they can find it." And I was like, "This no, this
No,
it's not
no.
time."
This is the
but the
wrong.
but I'm new to the Okanagan too, so I didn't know, because you used a great analogy talking about how grapevines actually grow and what it means to actually be attached to the grapevine. And so I was wondering if you could break that down for a bit. One, why you think that that analogy is super important
Mhm.
for the church moving forward,
Mhm.
and people moving forward, but then also just what that analogy was of the grapevine and how
Mhm.
grapes actually grow. I find it super interesting
Yeah.
and like exciting. So yeah, could you just share that with us?
Yes. So I think the reason, uh, well, I'll answer your first question first. Why is it important? Um, I think it's important because the whole analogy there that Jesus gives us in John 15. As you said, it's about the vines, the branches, and the grapevines, and us remaining attached to Jesus. And I think it's important for all of us, whether we're in ministry or just no matter what we're doing vocationally, just as followers of Jesus, we all need to remain connected to him. That is the most important thing. Um, it's the fundamental part of our walk with him is staying connected to him. It's
Mm-hmm.
not optional, and it's not just so that we can thrive, which is what John 15 tells us. Like staying connected to him, you will thrive. But it's not just so that we'll thrive, it's so that we'll actually just flat out survive. Like if we want to survive the thing, we've got to
Mm-hmm.
stay connected to him. So yes, as you said, John 15 is such a great I mean, in a room full of pastors, it's tough, right? Because everybody's like, oh, everybody knows it.
Yeah.
Everybody knows the abide passage, the abiding in Jesus passage. And for those of you who are maybe listening and wouldn't, it's not coming to you right off the top of your head. It's that great. We looked at the first 8 verses in the conference, but it's that great part of scripture where Jesus essentially says, "I'm the vine, you are the branches, and apart from me, you can do nothing." Which I think is the synopsis most, like the one sentence synopsis that most people take from that. And I think that was even the one on the bookmark, which I never saw,
Yeah.
but I heard about.
You never saw it?
I never saw it. I was like, how do I get one of
Oh.
these? And it was intentional. They knew what I was preaching on, and so it was designed and everything. But I didn't get one.
Hmm.
I should ask about that. But anyways, it's a great verse, and that's not a bad synopsis of the verses. But I actually wanted in that talk just to rewind to consider that there's actually a third player, or that's maybe not a great word, but a third
Hmm.
character in the story, and it's God. Because
Hmm.
verse 1 of John 15 says, Jesus says, "I am the true vine, and my Father is the gardener." And
Hmm.
I don't know if that, for everybody else, that gets overlooked, but I think it does. At least in my own experience, it has gotten overlooked. And so, in our time together that night, we just talked about God as our vine dresser, which is actually the more accurate word there, not just gardener, but vine dresser, and his role of being a vine dresser. And so that's kind of what we took this look at. What is the job of a vine dresser? Like right now, today in the Okanagan, what does a vine dresser actually do?
Yeah.
And it was really fascinating. I think it's so fascinating to look at that kind of stuff. And it's just, to me, the more research I did around it, I was like, man, Jesus, you're so brilliant. You knew exactly what you were doing when you used this illustration for us, even not just calling you the vine and us the branches, but calling God the vine dresser, that he is there in the picture around taking care of and
Mm.
tending to us. And so we talked about 2 things. There's so many things we could have talked about, but the 2 things, just given the time that we had, we talked about the fact that God is our vine dresser, plants us and he prunes us. And one of the things we talked about with planting is that he plants, so vine dressers, just in general, this is true of any vine dresser in the world, they plant grapevines in rocky soil because that's
Mm.
where they thrive. They could be planted in regular soil, but if they are planted in regular soil where there's no rocks or anything to cause it to have to work in order to grow, then what it does is it puts off a bunch of just leaves, just big old beautiful. I mean, it'll look really pretty, but it's not going
Yeah.
to have any fruit. And
Hmm.
so, in order for a grapevine to bear fruit, it has to be planted in rocky. Actually, the preference would even be slopy soil, or a slopy hillside with rocky soil. And it's it's just so interesting to me, that whole idea, because whenever vines are planted in rocky soil, they have to work more. They have to like make real decisions. Am I
Mm.
going to put off leaves, or but they know that that's not their purpose. Their purpose is to produce grapes. So they essentially put all their nutrients then into the production of grapes. And
Mm.
and so any good vine dresser knows that it really matters where they plant a vine, and then they know that they have to prune it, which is not a crazy thing for us to think about. We know that God will prune us, but I just thought it was interesting. I learned a few things. One, probably the most I won't go through. I'm not going to preach the whole sermon right now, but I'll just say that probably, and John Mark and I were talking about this afterwards, actually, because what I found is that the older a vine gets, the more it needs to be pruned.
Mm,
And so and then a vine dresser not just prunes it like easy, it's like it has to prune it hard in order for it to keep bearing grapes. And that's usually at about the 10-year mark. Whenever it's been planted for about 10 years, 10 years and beyond, that's whenever a vine dresser starts pruning the mature vines harder. And I just found that so interesting because it's like, there's a world where we sometimes think that when you've been doing it long enough, it just becomes like muscle memory. I don't know
yeah.
if that's a fair statement to make, but you figured it out. You know how to you've got your rule of life, you're doing Sabbath, you've got your spiritual rhythms. You know what it is to have, work life balance. You got community. You're doing all the things. And then God comes along and prunes you in some way and you're like, "What?" Like I was doing all the things. And
Hmm.
what I love about that though is that he's so committed to us, I think, and I would argue until the day he takes us home to be fruitful. I do not
Mm,
want to be an old woman sitting in my house by myself watching Netflix or whatever the equivalent of that is going to be. I want to be I want to be spending and pouring my life out bearing fruit even if that means him pruning me for the next
yeah.
half of my life. Um until he takes me home. Like that to me, it was a beautiful thing for me to know that vine dressers um don't just uproot a vine once it gets older and I'll start all over again with something new.
Hmm.
He's very committed to the mature vines. So, yeah,
Well,
lots
and
of
it,
good stuff
yeah,
there.
yeah, there's a ton. Well, and I found it really encouraging. I find those examples of like when you can actually figure out what the Bible's talking about, because you hear the analogy, you're like, oh, okay, I get it. But when you actually like really start to understand what that means, it's so interesting. Because I used to live in Saskatchewan, I lived in like Alberta and Saskatchewan my whole life until recently. And so a lot of the analogies I didn't get about and I didn't think they were that important. So, like, one example is like being grafted in, because the Bible
Yeah.
talks about how like Gentiles are grafted into the tree and whatever. I didn't really understand what that looked like. And then being in the valley, when they were driving me around and showing me when I first started showing up, they're like, oh, that tree is like a non-grafted in tree and that's a grafted in one. And you could like see the difference and be like, oh, well, one, I'm mildly offended, Jesus, because the non-grafted in trees look very beautiful. The grafted in ones look like sticks. But you were just able to have these different pictures that were like,
Yeah.
oh, that makes so much sense. And so with that too, I found it super encouraging because Jesus is a smart guy.
Yeah.
And coming out of COVID and even just the current climate we're in now, it can feel like, man, this is so hard.
Mhm.
And to focus on the negative and how hard it is can be really discouraging. But then to recognize that that's always been when the church has thrived. It's not when
Always.
the soil is easy. And the thing is, the church can look beautiful when the soil is easy. And like a grapevine, it can like look at all these leaves. Doesn't it look beautiful? But there's no real fruit. But it's when things are hard and rocky and difficult that's when fruit starts to happen. And even with pruning too, so interesting about how they have to prune them more and more and it doesn't just kind of end and they don't replace it, and that being a metaphor for the life of a Christian, because it
Mhm.
always feels like you're never done. And people who are like, oh yeah, I've arrived, it's
Mhm.
always like those are always the people where you're like, I really think you're I don't think you are very self-aware. um that it always feels like you're always learning and growing. And that's the whole thing with the Reconstructionist podcast for me, is in the deconstruction, I'm like, that's what Christians have always done. And there's different things that people call it and there's different ways, it's like that's not exactly what I mean. But in the sense as the church is always going through a pruning and then a rebuilding, whether it's our belief of like Catholicism and religion and like the Pope. And so like 500 years ago, Martin Luther was like, hey guys, time to prune some of this stuff. And even whether it's recently, whether it was like a hyper seeker sensitive movement where we were like, actually, was that the best way to do discipleship? Where we were doing what Dallas Willard called like the Great Omission. We're looking for converts instead of disciples. And we're always going through that kind of rethinking and reconstructing and rebuilding, and that doesn't end is encouraging because it means that, well, it's also kind of discouraging as someone who's like a personality that just wants to know the right answers and get it right and life be
No.
black and white. I'm like, it's all gray and I'm going to be wrong. And in 5 years, I'll look back at some of the stuff I think and be like, that was silly.
Yeah.
That's discouraging, but it's actually not because God's on this journey with us. And that's the whole point. I find that super encouraging.
Yeah.
Um, and even
That's really
thinking about where the church can head from here. But for you, when you're looking at the church, especially in the West, because it's our context, and specifically
mhm,
Canada, because it's also our context,
mhm,
what do you think that looks like? What do you think the pruning is? What do you think are the difficult things we have to face and work through to have fruit? Like, what do you think the church needs to do moving forward um, if we want to thrive instead of just
mhm.
survive?
Yeah, well, I think that's a great question. I think we've talked about it a lot, even over the last several minutes together, in that I suspect that the key to the church thriving is discipleship.
Mm,
I think there's a disconnect if we think that, I just think that evangelism involves discipleship.
mm,
When we try to separate the two, it doesn't work. Evangelism is tied up with discipleship. And so how are we making disciples? How are we walking with followers of Jesus? What are
mm,
we doing with men and women and young people, old people, whenever they have gone through, let's say, alpha, and they've completed alpha, then what? Like,
yeah.
and that's not, I'm not suggesting that we over program people. I'm suggesting that we're
Mm-hmm.
doing life on life with people.
Mm,
I'm utterly convinced that, maybe that's a really strong statement, but I am pretty convinced that the future of the church is just local churches doing uh, one-on-one and community discipleship. I'm not. I'm not. This is not to speak against mega churches. I know people who are involved in mega churches, and I love them, and they're wonderful
mm-hmm.
people. I just don't know if that's the future of the church in Canada or the Western Canada,
Mm,
uh, because it's really hard to know what the fruit of our labor is whenever you don't know the names of your people in your church.
yeah.
Now, again, I have attended very very large churches and was loved and felt, so that's not, I'm not speaking against um, large churches. I just wonder about the future of Canada, and if it won't just be the local church doing their thing, staying
Mm,
faithful. And I do see even this CCLN event. What's really encouraging to me is I hope so badly that we can be more in partnership with other churches around us.
mm-hmm.
We're here, like for our church, let's say we're in a neighborhood called Strathcona, and we're trying to reach out to Strathcona, but we know there's other churches um, right downtown Vancouver. We want to partner with them to make sure that, like, we know where we're all at. And one of the first things actually that Jason, Jeremy, and Chris, who were kind of the three lead pastors at our church, when we first decided to move into the city, they started meeting with other pastors in the city because they just wanted to know, like, get their finger on the pulse of what's happening in the church in the city.
Mm,
And I think that, and again, the CCLN event was kind of a great example of pastors coming together,
mm-hmm.
exchanging ideas, not being threatened. We're doing this together. All of this is for the same goal. We're all trying to disciple people and to make mature followers of Jesus. We might be doing that in different ways, but let's trade ideas. Um,
Mm-hmm.
let's train together. And so, anyways, I suspect that that'll be. Maybe a thing in Canada in the future. I hope it will be.
Yeah.
But again, kind of circling back to, and this is why we ended the conference that way, or at least this is what I was told when they asked me to come and share on that passage in John 15, is that we can have a lot of, I don't want to say formulas, but we can have a lot of things that we want to do, a lot of
Hmm.
um, ideas and vision, and that's all great. But none of it matters if we're not staying connected to
Hmm.
Jesus.
Hmm.
And I don't mean that like that sounds like maybe it sounds like a Sunday school kind of answer,
Yeah.
but, but the reality is that we cannot bear any kind of good fruit if we're not staying connected to Him, if we're not spending time with Him. And I don't, and I that all starts on an individual level.
Hmm.
That starts like for me, if I want my church to thrive, I need to be connected to Jesus. If I want my marriage to thrive, I need to be connected to Jesus. If
Hmm.
I want the people in my church to thrive in their relationships to Jesus, I have to be connected to Jesus. And it's not because I'm a pastor or because I'm on a teaching team or even because I'm on staff at a church. It's just because I'm a follower of Him and I'm a part of the body. And just like I feel that my connectedness to Him matters. We say this all the time in our own church. It matters that every person who would call the Way Church their home, that on an individual level, you have an individual relationship with the Lord.
Hmm.
And I think and that requires all of us individually to make a decision. I'm going to be connected to Him, and that person's going to stay connected, and that person's going to stay connected. And so, in
Hmm.
that way, when we're all individually connected, I think that does something as a community
Yeah.
into our church congregations. It makes healthier churches, for one thing. Um, but I don't see us being able to not only do the Great Commission, I also don't see us being able to love well or care for the
Hmm.
poor or do justice or seek mercy or stand up for the marginalized or defend the weak, or all of the things that we're called to do. I don't see us being able to do any of that if we're not intentionally staying connected to Jesus. um,
Hmm.
'Cause we can do all of those things. We can. Um, but what will bear much fruit, what will be done in a healthy way, I think I fully believe it's by all of us staying connected to Him. And I know that that's a big okay. That's a big sweeping statement. Just stay connected to Jesus. But I mean, this is this is this is again so much of what that conference was about. Um, and I loved the way Ken framed it. Ken Shigematsu was there.
Hmm.
He kind of had this like kind of a kind of a throwaway line that I wrote down and it stuck with me. And I think I even repeated it during my talk. But he called the practices that we do in spiritual formation. That's things like rule of life, Sabbath, reading the Bible, praying, fasting, all those things. He called those things the trellis on
Hmm.
which our vines hang, on which our branches hang.
Hmm.
Like we're connected to Jesus. We have a vine dresser who's planting us and pruning us, but spiritual formation, all those things, those are the trellis on which we're hanging our lives.
Hmm.
And I loved that picture. Um, anyways, but we should be doing all of those things, some of those things. And the longer you're walking with the Lord, the more you get to know when and how and it takes work. It takes real work, but
Yeah.
He's worth it.
Yeah. No, totally. Yeah. And Ken, I purchased his book. I can't
Okay.
remember the one, his first one, but he actually has an image in that book because I kind of flipped through it. I haven't read it yet, but then I stopped and I was like, oh, a picture. And he actually has a picture of that, of like the trellis and how spiritual disciplines and those kinds of things are the things that actually help you grow and be able to grow bigger than you could have before. And it's a really cool image of
Mhm.
spiritual growth and following Jesus. And even for what you're saying here, um, I kind of want to actually land on that.
Mhm.
Just the whole thing of like, if the church is going to thrive, we as individual followers of Jesus need to be like, okay, I need to get connected to the vine and actually like take this thing seriously. And for my relationship with Jesus, it sounds so simple because it's like stuff we all
Yeah.
know. It's the Sunday school answer, but it's really profound that if my relationship with Jesus isn't thriving, I can't expect. And if we as like collective church are going, yeah, we're just like not super interested in that right now, we can't expect the church to thrive. And so I just want you, as we conclude, to just speak to maybe the follower of Jesus who's struggling, who feels burnt out and tired, who's kind
Mm.
of been through COVID and is like, ugh, what you're
Yeah.
saying sounds great. I'd really love it. I'm just really, I'm just really tired.
Yeah.
And I want to be connected to the vine. I just don't even know where to start. Could you give some
Mm.
encouragement or advice to those who are kind of feeling, yeah, feeling like that?
Oh, sure. I again, I have a suspicion that I think that part of the overwhelm that we feel is because we're so busy. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
and so my encouragement would be that we need to begin to unbusy ourselves,
Mm-hmm.
kind of detach ourselves from whatever kind of endorphin hit we get from having so many things on the go. Um, and learn how to do. I mean, we've kind of hit on it again, or hit on it a few times today. Um, there are things that I think we ought to do. Again, pray, Sabbath, give, fast, learn again how to spend time with God every day. And these are maybe basic things, but I think generally we've just made ourselves far too busy to do even one of those things. And
Mm-hmm.
so it feels overwhelming. You have this list, you're like, "Oh, I can't do any of that. That sounds like if that's what it takes to remain connected to the vine, then count me out. Like maybe I'll just pray in my car on the way to work." And you know what? That's a good place to start. But there is a part of me that wonders if we cannot clear our schedules for him in some area, or if we're just kind of like trying to fit God into the nooks and crannies of our lives, just
Yeah.
in moments where we think he'll just sort of fit there, um, then we will keep feeling exhausted and we're going to feel like
Mm-hmm.
he's not really making a dent. I always think that spiritual disciplines, following Jesus, staying connected to him is so much like working out. You A, make a decision to do it, and B, you know that it might be hard at first, but
Mm.
give yourself what is the number? Isn't it like 27 days or something before a new habit's formed? Something like that.
Yeah.
And I'm speaking as a busy person, a mom. When my kids were young, very, very young, I had three little boys, four, one, and a newborn. And I remember feeling, I don't know how to do this. Like, I don't know where to fit you into my day except when I'm doing the dishes. And I felt like
Yeah.
there was grace for that. There is. There's
Yeah.
always a grace for those kinds of seasons. But I remember the Lord as clear as He can. I mean, it was not audible, but I really felt Him settle in my heart
Mm.
this kind of phrase. And it was like, Lita, if you will give me the first part of your day, then I will help you with the rest of your day.
Mm.
And it was kind of like this idea of tithing my time. And so I started, I must have been 25, I want to say 26. And I started setting my alarm and waking up a half hour before my kids. And it was brutal. It was so brutal at first. And I did not like it. I remember sitting there like angry at the Lord. But it became a habit.
Mm.
And it didn't take that long. And here I am a lot of years later, 13 years later. And it's my favorite part of the day. I do it every day. And that is my time with him, just him and I. Nobody else, nothing else gets my attention. And this is not a prescriptive thing for anybody. This is just where it fits in my day. The point here being is that we can find a spot in our day to be with him. And that's not, it doesn't need to be an hour. It can be,
Mm-hmm.
but you can start small and he'll be faithful to teach you right where you are. He knows where we are in our walk. where we are in our relationship with him. I think he's just so faithful to meet us where we're at. But if we don't do it, again, kind of how we started the conversation, my encouragement would be that we will not just kind of, again, stumble our way into fruitfulness with
Hmm.
the Lord, not stumble our way into a meaningful relationship with him. It takes uh, a willingness, and it takes some time to relearn how to sit with him, and it will bear mind blowing fruit in your life if you do that. But there's also, it's like, here's the great line, just do it. I remember Daryl Johnson said that to me. He said, do you want to know the key to a fruitful relationship with God? It's just do it. Like, you
Mm.
just follow him. That's what you do. And I was like, oh, that's just so simple. And sometimes the Sunday school answers are the best answers because they're
Yeah.
true. They're true.
Yeah. Well, that gives me two thoughts in conclusion. It makes me think of Daryl's line of just do it. Makes me think of something I was told about fitness years ago, where there was some guy who was like, imagine how fit you would be if you just if you actually just started working out the first time you said tomorrow I'm going to work out. You actually just did it. Imagine how much farther you would be now. And you're always like, way farther, because you're always like, tomorrow. I'll work
Yeah,
out
yeah.
tomorrow. I'll eat healthy tomorrow. It's the same thing spiritually. It's like if you just imagine, like, you can tell yourself, okay, I'll start reading my Bible for 5 minutes or praying for 2 minutes tomorrow. It's kind of like, why not now? Because the thing is, we as humans like to kind of push stuff off, and we have great hopes for ourselves, but we usually don't do it. And if we can imagine what it'd be like if we started getting, John Tyson talked about this in a podcast that I heard a long time ago at the beginning of COVID. And it was shortly after kind of the initial stuff, like several months in. And he was like, I feel like we missed it where we had this opportunity to like really get serious. And a lot of us went, no.
Yeah.
And imagine if in that moment we took the period of having nothing, you didn't have anything you had to go to, you were stuck at home. And if in that moment you decided, I'm going to start taking these things seriously, how much farther and happier you'd be now and more connected you would feel if you started then. And then with that too, with discipleship, we just recently changed because we're trying to figure this out as a church. And I don't know what the answers are. But for our high school Bible study that we have at the church, I'm a youth pastor. And
Mhm.
so we had it just be, it used to be like a weekly thing. You come and you'd say the Bible. And that was great. But we went, how is this helping them not just have information, but helping them actually learn how to follow Jesus when the program's not there anymore? And so we changed it to be a monthly thing that had like a meal together and was longer. And also we would go through, we would have them read a chapter from a Bible that's called the Net Bible, and they have like a cool study Bible or study journal, depending which one you get. That's called the Abide Journal. That actually like puts like spiritual practices, or it's not just like, because I'm a Type 5 on the Enneagram. So when I open
Mhm.
up my ESV study Bible and it's got like a lot of notes, I'm like, yeah. But my wife has pointed out that the notes are helpful, but if the notes don't actually lead to like it changing your life, they're kind of useless. And so this Bible is specifically made for that. That's like, let's take this passage and actually figure out what is this, how can this actually affect your relationship with God?
Mhm.
And so we had them do that while they were there. And then we also did a session of John Mark Comer's Practicing the Way. Right now we're on Sabbath. And so when they leave for the month, we told them, listen, we love that you're all here. And this sounds really intense. And this isn't very churchy of us because usually churches are like, yeah, everybody's welcome. But we're like, for this specific thing, like our youth gatherings open to everybody, there's no requirement. But for this, if you want to come to the next session, you have to have not succeeded, but at least tried to do a Sabbath. And we will help you with that. And you have to have read the next chapter of James. And I remember one student looked at me and was like, he's like, I don't have time for this. When am I gonna do? And in my mind too, I'm like, you have time. Like you're gonna
Yeah.
like it's not a big ask. but but I was like, but it was interesting because I did tell him, I was like, I think that if you're too busy to read one chapter of the Bible in a month and to try to have a Sabbath, you might be too busy
Mhm.
in general. But I think for us as adults that is also true that we over, and it's hard because people have kids. I don't have kids yet, And I've been told that the older you get, the more you think I'll have more time. And it's not. No, you lose more and more time. Where when I was a high schooler, I was like, oh, I have no time. And you
Yeah.
have actually all the time in the world, you just don't feel like it. And then in college, I was like, oh, I don't have time for anything. And I was looking back, I'm like, I had so much time. What was I complaining
What
about?
am I doing?
And now I'm married and I'm like, oh, I don't have time. And I'm like, what? I have so much time. Imagine if I had kids and they have like soccer practice I have to go to. And you're like, ow, I can't go
Yeah.
home. But it is an interesting thought to be like, are we making time for those things? And not that God isn't in you, in your kid's soccer practice and with you in that and stuff, but there is like an intentionality of being discipled by Jesus and by others that we often don't prioritize over Netflix or being a part of a recreational sport or whatever.
Mhm.
This is an interesting challenge for us in the West.
Mhm.
And as John Mark Comer would say, unhurrying your life to make space for God, not doing more, but actually
Right.
thinking, what can I take away?
Exactly. This is not an add-on to what you're already doing. This is a
Hmm.
this is a prompt to go, is there something actually that can be removed from my life to make room for
Yeah.
paying attention to what God's up to, not only in myself, but in the world. I mean, this is my son is 17, he's graduating next year. So we're having the big conversations around vocation and college. And so we were just talking about, yeah, these questions and that really matter. And they take real time to consider. Um,
Hmm.
I think I know God is merciful because I lived so much of my life in a hurry,
Yeah.
busy, not doing spiritual disciplines. I hadn't even heard of the spiritual disciplines.
Hmm.
Do you know what I'm saying? And so
Yeah.
there's a grace for it. I think that, like in all things, though, in all things, once you become aware of something, you have a sense of responsibility then in which to go, what am I going to do with this?
Hmm.
Um, and I feel that for a lot of things, whether that's for our spiritual walk with the Lord, or if that's in you know find out about a justice issue that you can impact. So, anyways,
Yeah.
yeah,
No, totally. Alita, this has been great. I want to value your
yeah.
time and you've been more than generous. If people want to hear more from you or follow you, what's the best way for them to do that?